The moment Alex Brooks realized he'd made a terrible mistake, the studio lights felt suffocatingly bright. His signature smirk, the one that had launched countless viral moments and cemented his reputation as television's most fearless interviewer, froze on his face. In the sudden silence, you could hear the collective intake of breath from the studio audience. No one had expected Melania Trump's response, least of all Alex. But that moment of reckoning was still hours away. The day had started like any other at Studio 7B in Rockefeller Center, where Late Night with Alex Brooks had reigned supreme for 6 seasons. The show's staff buzzed with barely contained excitement. After months of negotiations, they'd finally landed the interview everyone wanted, Melania Trump's first in-depth television appearance since leaving the White House. Alex sat in his dressing room, reviewing his notes one last time. The blue index cards contained the usual mix of lighthearted questions and subtle jabs, building to what he was certain would be the night's viral moment. His producer had warned him about going too far, but Alex had brushed off the concern. After all, pushing boundaries was his brand. 5 minutes to air, a PA called through the door. In the green room, Melania Trump sat perfectly composed, her expression unreadable. Unlike most guests, she hadn't brought an entourage of handlers and PR people, just her personal assistant and a single security detail. The show's staff had expected demands, riders, pre-interview conditions. Instead, they got something far more unsettling: quiet confidence. The floor director's voice crackled over the intercom. 3 minutes, people. Places. As the audience filtered in, their phones ready to capture whatever drama might unfold, no one suspected they were about to witness something that would change the landscape of television interviews forever. They didn't know that in less than an hour, a single question would trigger a response so powerful it would leave Alex Brooks speechless for the first time in his career. The band struck up the show's familiar opening theme. Alex straightened his tie, flashed his trademark grin, and bounded onto the stage. The applause washed over him like a wave, familiar and energizing. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something unprecedented was about to unfold. What happened next would not only silence a studio audience, it would spark a national conversation about dignity, grace, and the power of words left unspoken. The studio lights dimmed slightly as Melania Trump made her entrance. Her steps were measured, deliberate, each click of her heels echoing across the suddenly hushed stage. The audience's applause felt uncertain, a mix of genuine welcome and tentative restraint. Some clapped enthusiastically, others held back, as if waiting to see how this unlikely encounter would unfold. Alex Brooks rose from behind his desk, his trademark smile firmly in place. But those who knew him well might have noticed something different in his eyes, a glimmer of uncertainty perhaps, or the faintest trace of nervous energy. This wasn't his usual political target, easy to provoke and quick to anger. This was Melania Trump, an enigma who had perfected the art of silence. "Welcome to the show," Alex began, his voice carrying its usual confident charm. "I have to say, we've been trying to get you here for quite some time." Melania smiled, a gentle expression that revealed nothing. "Thank you for having me, Alex." The simplicity of her response caught him slightly off guard. He'd prepared for defensive walls, for carefully crafted PR responses. Instead, he got 4 words, delivered with unexpected warmth. Alex shifted in his chair, adjusting his strategy. "You know, most people who leave the White House can't wait to tell their story, but you've been notably quiet. Why break your silence now?" "Sometimes," Melania replied, her accent adding weight to each word. "The right moment finds you. You don't find it," the audience murmured. This wasn't the rehearsed political speak they'd expected. Alex felt the interview already sliding away from his carefully planned script. He leaned forward, injecting a hint of challenge into his voice. "That's interesting, because many people have suggested your silence was actually a statement in itself, a rejection of your time in Washington, maybe even of your—" "Is that what people suggest?" Melania interrupted softly, her smile unchanging. Or is that what makes a better story? The audience's collective intake of breath was audible. Alex's smile flickered for just a moment. In all his years of interviews, he'd never been cut off so elegantly, with such quiet authority. But Alex Brooks hadn't built his career by backing down. He glanced at his blue index cards, at the carefully crafted questions designed to provoke and expose. The easy banter was over. It was time to push harder. "Let's talk about January 6th, he said, his tone sharpening. "You were in the White House that day. Your silence during those events was deafening. Were you making a statement then?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. The audience leaned forward, phones forgotten in their hands. Even the cameramen held their breath. Melania's expression hadn't changed, but something in her eyes shifted. The next words she spoke would not only stun Alex Brooks, they would rewrite the rules of political interviews forever. Melania's voice, when it came, filled the studio with a quiet strength that made every other sound fade away. Her accent seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by a clarity that commanded attention. "You know, Alex," she began, her eyes meeting his directly, "everyone thinks silence is weakness. But sometimes silence is the loudest way to speak truth." She paused, allowing her words to settle in the air. The audience sat motionless, phones lowered, completely absorbed in the moment unfolding before them. "On January 6th, I was not silent because I had nothing to say. I was silent because some moments in history are bigger than sound bites and ratings." Her gaze never wavered from Alex's increasingly uncomfortable expression. "While everyone was shouting, I was watching. While they were performing for cameras, I was thinking about the weight of that day on our nation's soul." Alex shifted in his chair, his usual smirk completely gone now. He opened his mouth to interject, but Melania continued with a gentle authority that made interruption impossible. "You want me to give you a headline. You want me to say something inflammatory that will go viral." She smiled, but it wasn't the practiced smile of a politician's wife. It was something more genuine, almost sad. "Instead, I will tell you what I learned in my years of being judged, criticized, and misunderstood. True strength isn't in making the loudest noise. It's in knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to let silence tell its own story." The studio was so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Even the cameramen seemed to be holding their breath. One of the producers wiped tears from her eyes, trying to remain professional but clearly moved. If you're feeling moved by this powerful moment of truth and authenticity, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories that go beyond headlines to touch the heart of what matters. Now, as the studio sat in stunned silence, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Alex's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. This wasn't how these interviews were supposed to go. His carefully crafted provocations had somehow transformed into something else entirely, a moment of genuine human connection that no one had expected. "But surely," he attempted, his voice less steady than before, "you must have regrets. Looking back at everything that happened, all the controversy, the criticism, do you ever wish you had chosen a different path?" The question hung in the air like a suspended moment in time. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. What Melania said next would not only silence Alex Brooks, it would become one of the most quoted responses in television history. Her lips parted, and the truth she spoke was about to change everything. Melania's response came with a gentleness that belied its impact. "Regret," she said, the word floating in the air like a quiet revelation, "is what happens when you live your life for other people's expectations." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Alex's face. "You ask if I wish I had chosen differently, but you're not really asking about choices, are you, Alex? You're asking if I regret being who I am." The audience collectively held their breath. In the control room, producers stood transfixed, fingers frozen above their switchboards. This wasn't just good television anymore. This was something raw, something real. I've been a model, a businesswoman, a mother, and yes, a first lady. People have tried to put me in boxes my entire life. Her voice carried no bitterness, only clarity. They want me to be either a victim or a villain. But I am neither. I am simply a woman who has lived her life on her own terms. Alex's famous composure cracked visibly. His hands fumbled with his index cards, dropping them onto his desk. The carefully crafted question suddenly seemed small, almost childish in the face of such authenticity. "But the criticism," he started. "is the price of being true to yourself," she finished. "You see, Alex, people think they want honesty. But what they often want is confirmation of what they already believe. Real honesty? That makes people uncomfortable." She paused, a soft smile touching her lips as she looked out at the audience. "So, no, I don't regret my choices. I don't regret my silence when others demanded I speak, or my words when others wished I would stay quiet. Because at the end of the day, the only person who has to live with your choices is you." The studio erupted in spontaneous applause. Not the polite, prompted kind that talk shows typically generated, but something genuine and thunderous. In the third row, a young woman wiped tears from her cheeks. Near the back, a man in a business suit stood up, clapping with unabashed admiration. Alex Brooks, for the first time in his broadcasting career, was completely speechless. The smirk that had launched 1,000 memes was replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. But what happened next would transform this unexpected moment of television into something even more extraordinary. Because sometimes the most powerful moments come after the applause dies down. As the clapping subsided, Melania reached into her purse and pulled out something that made Alex Brooks' face turn pale. It was a simple blue index card, one that would reveal just how deeply this evening's events had been orchestrated. The blue index card trembled slightly in Melania's perfectly manicured hands. The studio lights caught its edges, revealing familiar handwriting that made Alex's throat go dry. It was his own writing, words he'd scribbled down just hours before, planning what he thought would be the interview's devastating finale. "I believe," Melania said softly, "you were planning to end with this question." She held up the card, but didn't read from it immediately. Instead, her eyes met Alex's with a mixture of understanding and gentle reproach. In the control room, the director's hand froze above the switch. This wasn't in the script. Nobody had seen this coming. The camera operators instinctively tightened their shots, catching every micro-expression that crossed Alex Brooks's usually confident face. "How did you?" Alex started, his voice barely above a whisper. "You left these in the green room earlier," Melania explained, her tone free of accusation. "Your final question was going to be, after everything that's happened, everything you've seen and know, how do you sleep at night?" The audience gasped. Even for Alex Brooks, known for his brutal takedowns, this would have been cruel. A few people booed, but Melania raised her hand gently, silencing them. "I want to answer this question, Alex. Not because you plan to ambush me with it, but because it's something I've thought about every day since leaving the White House." She placed the card on the desk between them, a bridge rather than a barrier. "The truth is, I sleep at night because I know who I am. I sleep because I've never pretended to be perfect, never claimed to have all the answers. I sleep because at the end of each day, I've faced myself in the mirror and stayed true to my own conscience." The silence in the studio was absolute. Even the usual shuffling and coughing had ceased. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath, witnessing something that transcended mere television. Alex's face had lost all color. His trademark confidence had crumbled, replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. But what happened next would surprise everyone, most of all, him. Melania reached across the desk and placed her hand gently on his trembling fingers. "The real question, Alex, is how do you sleep at night? Not just you, but all of us who choose to feed the anger, the division, the hunger for conflict." Her words weren't just for Alex anymore. They reached through the cameras, beyond the studio walls, touching something deep in the national consciousness. But no one could have predicted what Alex Brooks would do next, an action that would redefine his career and change the landscape of television journalism forever. Alex Brooks did something no one had ever seen him do in 6 seasons of late-night television. He removed his microphone. The small action sent waves of whispered confusion through the studio audience. In the control room, producers frantically signaled to the camera operators, unsure how to handle this unprecedented breach of protocol. But Alex wasn't finished. He stood up from behind his desk, walked around to where Melania sat, and did the unthinkable. He knelt down beside her chair. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice raw and unfiltered without the microphone. The boom operators swung their equipment closer, desperate to catch his words. "Not just to you, but to everyone I've treated as a target rather than a person." The studio fell so quiet you could hear the gentle whir of the cameras. Melania's expression softened as she watched this transformation unfold before her. "For years," Alex continued, his voice growing stronger, "I've justified what I do as holding people accountable. But tonight, you held me accountable in a way I never expected." He glanced at the blue index card, still lying on his desk. "You showed me what real strength looks like." A tear rolled down his cheek, unscripted, unexpected, real. In that moment, Alex Brooks wasn't television's most fearless interviewer. He was simply a man facing his own truth. Melania reached out and helped him to his feet, a gesture of such natural grace that it brought tears to the eyes of hardened crew members. "Strength," she said softly, "is also in knowing when to change." The audience watched in stunned silence as Alex returned to his desk. His hands were steady now as he gathered his remaining index cards. Without ceremony or flourish, he tore them in half. "I think," he said, finally retrieving his microphone, "it's time we had a real conversation. Not about politics or controversy, but about what it means to be human in a world that often forgets the importance of dignity." What followed wasn't just an interview. It was a conversation that would be referenced in journalism schools for decades to come. But even as Alex and Melania began this unprecedented dialogue, something else was happening beyond the studio walls, something that would reshape the very nature of public discourse in America. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions start not with a shout, but with a moment of honest silence. Within minutes of the show's end, social media exploded. But this wasn't the usual storm of angry tweets and divisive memes. Something different was happening, something that would reshape how America talked to itself. The first clip to go viral wasn't a gotcha moment or an angry exchange. It was the simple sight of Alex Brooks kneeling, speaking without his microphone, choosing authenticity over entertainments. Within an hour, it had been viewed 10 million times. In newsrooms across the country, producers and anchors watched in stunned silence. At CNN, a veteran journalist turned to his producer and said, "When was the last time we had a real conversation on air?" Fox News analysts sat in their green room, phones forgotten in their hands, absorbing what they'd just witnessed. #Dignity Wins began trending, followed quickly by #Real Conversations. But unlike typical viral hashtags, these weren't being used to attack or divide. People began sharing their own stories of moments when putting aside pride led to unexpected understanding. A producer from a rival network called the studio, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, she said. "Tonight made me remember why I got into television in the first place." Back in the studio, long after the audience had left, Alex sat alone at his desk. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, celebrities, and politicians, all wanting to know how this would change his show going forward. But he was focused on something else, a small note Melania had left behind. "Remember," it read in elegant script, "true power lies not in making others feel small, but in helping them find their greatness." The next morning, network executives gathered for an emergency meeting. Ratings for the interview had broken every record in late-night history. But these weren't the usual metrics of conflict and controversy. People had tuned in and stayed, captivated by something they didn't realize they'd been starving for: authentic human connection. As clips continued to circulate, something extraordinary began happening in the world of media. Other hosts started abandoning their gotcha questions. Political panels shifted from shouting matches to actual discussions. It wasn't just a trend, it was a transformation. But the most significant change was yet to come, because in a small diner in Ohio, a young waitress watched the interview on her phone during her break, tears streaming down her face. What she decided to do next would prove that one moment of genuine truth could spark a movement that would touch lives across the nation. The young waitress in Ohio was named Sarah Mitchell. After watching the interview, she created a simple social media post about her own experience with judgment and dignity in her daily life. She never expected it to reach beyond her few hundred followers, but something about her words struck a chord. "Today," she wrote, "I watched someone choose grace over power, and it made me realize how many times I've had that same choice in my own life. Even serving coffee, I can choose between judgment and understanding." Her post was shared thousands of times, then hundreds of thousands. Other service workers began sharing their stories, then teachers, doctors, politicians, police officers. Each story added another thread to a tapestry of human connection that was spreading across the country. A week after the interview, Alex Brooks opened his show differently. Gone was the flashy introduction and sarcastic monologue. Instead, he simply sat at his desk and talked about the letters he'd received, stories of reconciliation between estranged family members, colleagues finding common ground, strangers showing unexpected kindness. "We've been doing it wrong," he admitted to his audience. "We thought ratings came from conflict, but you've shown us they come from truth." The numbers proved him right. His show's audience grew, not despite the new approach, but because of it. Other shows began to follow suit. The landscape of late-night television shifted from cynicism to genuine conversation. Melania Trump watched these changes unfold from a distance, declining all requests for follow-up interviews. But 3 months later, she did something unexpected. She agreed to meet privately with a group of journalism students who had written to her about the impact of that night. In a small classroom at Columbia University, she shared something she hadn't mentioned during the interview. "That night," she told them, "I was prepared for battle. I had my own defensive answers ready, but sometimes the bravest thing you can do is lay down your armor and show your humanity." The real legacy of that evening wasn't just in changed television formats or viral hashtags. It was in the small, daily moments where people began choosing differently. A parent listening to a teenager instead of lecturing. A teacher asking about a student's story instead of judging their behavior. A politician admitting uncertainty instead of attacking opponents. 1 year later, Sarah Mitchell opened her own cafe in Ohio. She called it Grace Notes. On the wall hung a framed quote, "Dignity isn't just for special occasions. It's a choice we make every day." The interview that silenced America had done more than create a viral moment. It had reminded people of a simple truth, that in a world desperate for connection, sometimes the most powerful act is to set aside performance and simply be human. If this story touched you, remember, every day offers countless opportunities to choose grace over judgment, understanding over conflict. The revolution of dignity doesn't need a television studio. It starts with our next interaction, our next conversation, our next chance to see the humanity in each other. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power we all have to change the world, one moment of grace at a time.